For 19 years, Earth moved beneath the shadow of compliance. The treaty grid, enacted by unanimous vote of the Galactic Council, had not been a declaration of war, just a framework. A framework that defined who could trade where, whose intellectual property could be certified across sectors, and which systems were permitted primary corridor access. Earth, still classified as a post-expansion junior entity, was boxed in by clauses phrased to appear neutral. The language was polished, procedural. But behind the subcommittees and rotating chairs, everyone knew the truth. Earth had been quarantined economically, locked into perimeter supply routes, and denied equitable patent recognition. They were allowed to speak at council forums, but not vote. Allowed to submit innovations, but not monetize them without licensing intermediaries. Every move forward was shadowed by the grid. And yet Earth played along. Not through confrontation, through engineering. The pivot began in the inner gravity wells of Sol 3, where terrestrial limitations forced precision over spectacle. Instead of building dreadnoughts, Earth built reactors, small, sealed, and flawless. The Clean Seal reactor was not glamorous. It did not boast weapon applications or warp signatures. It simply worked, indefinitely. No maintenance crews, no coolant failures, zero performance drift over time. At first, no one noticed. Earth's trade partners were few, and Clean Seal units weren't marketed under Earth's flag. But 6 years later, when supply forecasts from the Concord's own naval fleets showed over 50% replacement with off-brand sealed core conversion packs, alarms started to ring. The reactors weren't Earth's in name, but in function. They all bore Sol signatures. Verification teams traced them back through 3 layers of proxy licensing to an orbital fab array outside Phobos Station. That station was Earth-aligned. The Volrix Concord, a high-yield economic coalition spanning 5 major empires, called it stealth influence. Earth, they claimed, had violated intent, if not letter. A tribunal was summoned. Neutral ground was selected. Jervan's table, a diplomatic moon positioned inside a stabilized Lagrange pocket, chosen for its neutrality and record of non-hostile resolution. The council called for open arbitration. Earth complied. No delay, no protest. Their envoy, Consul Darren Volan, arrived aboard a civilian diplomatic vessel with a skeletal staff and no security presence. The council took this as weakness. It wasn't. Volan wasn't a figurehead. He was the architect of Earth's Plexus Doctrine, a silent protocol embedded across interstellar infrastructure since the grid's ratification. He carried no weapons. But in the lining of his diplomatic robes were coded fibers that signaled readiness markers to satellite mesh relays now orbiting Jervan's table. The signals were non-hostile. They didn't trigger alarms. They weren't meant to. They simply confirmed phase alignment across Earth's distributed fallback systems. On the second day of tribunal preparation, Earth's sentient signal service flagged multiple mirrored registry war cruisers maneuvering through corridor junctions. The crafts had been scrubbed of alliance codes, bearing generic diplomatic tags, but their energy signatures mapped closely to Volrix battle systems. Within 3 hours, 16 Earth-aligned trade stations, spanning 4 sectors, went dark. Not destroyed, not openly attacked, severed. Power readings vanished mid-cycle. Communications cut at the root level. Log feeds corrupted. When Earth's Council delegations submitted emergency inquiry notices to confirm loss of signal, the responses from Council oversight committees were formulaic. Insufficient evidence, review scheduled pending tribunal out. Come, advisory silence requested until biocontainment assessment concluded. Volan stood alone in Jervan's primary chamber that evening, watching the orbital traffic feeds. It wasn't difficult to read between the lines. No ships moved above the table. No broadcasts. Even the Council's own security nodes had gone silent. Earth's delegation had not been arrested, but they had been rendered invisible. Their access to auxiliary channels was cut. Mobility requests denied. The diplomatic moon had entered biocontainment status, protocol triggered when potential pathogenic breaches threatened multi-species gatherings. No symptoms had been reported. No diagnostics flagged any anomalies. Yet the chamber's doors now required retinal confirmation from council marshals. Earth's team was not allowed to leave. Outside the sealed chamber, a single orb of light rotated above the diplomatic dais, slowly dimming on a 7-second loop. It was a signal used only during Level 4 lock-ins. Not war, not emergency, just containment. A freeze-frame solution. No blame, no hostilities, no pathway to resolution. Volan did not pace. He did not speak. He simply adjusted the inner fold of his tunic, triggering the first of 3 passive-ready confirmations through his internal tap line. In orbit, the escort ship Silent Meridian received the pulse. Quietly, without a single transmission burst, it began realigning its satellite chain to bypass Jervin's regulatory relay. This was not a breakdown of diplomacy. It was its planned exhaustion. The tribunal had never intended to listen. The council did not want answers. They wanted submission, timed around plausible deniability. And for years, Earth had allowed the theater to play. Let them write the grid. Let them measure influence by control. Because Earth had not been building influence. It had been building the world that came after theirs collapsed. And that world had just begun waking up. In the stillness above Jervin's table, the escort vessel Silent Meridian adjusted its orbital trajectory by 0.6 degrees, an imperceptible drift masked by station-keeping auto-routines. To council eyes, it remained compliant, a passive civilian escort with no armed capabilities and no unauthorized movement. But deep within its hull, shielded by 4 redundant false registries, the ship's cold-rooted satellite spine activated. Tiny black node arrays, dormant since launch, detached from its lower bay and deployed into a synchronized halo. They did not transmit. They didn't need to. Their function wasn't communication, it was isolation. Designed to operate without broadcast signatures, the arrays began tunneling into nearby grid junctions, silently hijacking satellite identifiers and rerouting planetary signal mesh. It was a mirror lattice. What the council thought it saw was now a filtered duplicate, one that showed no anomalies. Silent Meridian was now invisible, not because it had cloaked itself, but because it had rewritten what visibility meant. Inside the carrier's secondary bay, 5 units from Earth's Evacuation Directorate stepped out of sealed compression pods. They were not military. No weapons, no armor, no insignia. Each team carried modular kit cases marked only with minimalist anchor glyphs. Their purpose was neither war nor recovery. Their presence meant one thing: irreversible infrastructure denial. Terminal teams weren't designed to defend systems. They were trained to erase them. Systems the Council relied on. Stations their fleets resupplied at. Labs that certified their neural compliance arrays. Earth had no reason to threaten the Council directly. It simply intended to vanish in a way that removed the roads behind it. Quietly, without dramatics, without giving anyone a clear moment to declare hostility. As the Directorate teams descended toward planetary facilities under diplomatic code seals, the first wave of extraction began across Earth-aligned colonies. Civilian energy matrices began switching to fallback pulse loops, an innocuous power-saving feature, except these loops were encoded to initiate progressive overwrite of embedded logic. Bioconversion units, once leased under third-party agreements, began emitting null response flags to their monitoring hubs. Terraforming logic clusters, the backbone of regulated colony maintenance, entered slow clock degradation cycles, reducing their process integrity by 0.05% every standard hour. No alarms triggered. From the outside, it looked like minor latency, but the compounding decay would reach system failure thresholds within 3 rotations. Earth had not launched a strike. It had merely pulled the pins from a dozen foundations and walked away before anyone realized they were standing on hollowed ground. Meanwhile, in the sealed chamber on Jervin's table, Consul Volan requested arbitration continuation. His proposal was formal, measured. It offered reactor output ceilings for export licensing, third-party audit access for AI oversight protocols, and temporary moratoriums on additional tech deployment in contested systems. It was designed to look like capitulation, but it was, in truth, a time bomb of its own. Every clause required subcommittee review. Every audit condition necessitated external delegation from the conquered. Volan's speech was deliberately paced to stretch across multiple sessions. His tone neutral, his demeanor diplomatic. The council believed it had forced Earth to bend. In reality, it had been handed a decoy. Every minute they spent debating the proposal was another minute Earth spent unraveling the systems they all depended on. Buried beneath this operation was a strategy 10 years in the making, Sentinel Protocol Plexus. It was not a weapon, nor a piece of software. It was a doctrine, seeded quietly through Earth's export practices and licensing agreements. The premise was simple. Earth never scaled horizontally. It embedded vertically. Each system it shared, sold, or allowed to be duplicated carried compliance threads, tuning parameters, stabilization anchors, all designed to maintain optimal integration. But embedded within those same systems were inert forks, unused paths of logic, dormant branches of instruction. If activated simultaneously, they could begin rerouting authority permissions, distorting governance systems not with errors, but with too much accuracy. They followed the Council's rules so perfectly, so predictably, that they fed back into contradiction. Plexus didn't break systems. It turned them inward until they could no longer govern without collapsing from misalignment. With Phase 3 now engaged, that inversion had begun. Council planets equipped with Earth-built governance AIs started registering double verification failures. Archival registries demanded compliance rechecks for treaties long deemed immutable. Subspace relays dropped into silent override, interpreting Earth's departure not as a rogue act, but as a protocol-triggered reclassification. In the eyes of their own systems, the Council was now out of alignment with itself. Back on Jervin's table, Volan remained composed. He adjusted his seating posture precisely once every 7 minutes, enough to simulate natural restlessness, not enough to suggest anxiety. His attendants maintained silence, their datapads scrolling legal text that had already been decrypted, reviewed, and nullified back on Earth 2 weeks prior. This wasn't performance, it was bait. And the Council swallowed it. 14 minutes into procedural questioning, Volan's implanted relay pulsed once, harmless, unreadable by external scans. The message was brief. A pre-memorized signal path interpreted the pulse and unlocked its instruction. Declare closure, confirm receipt, initiate table extraction. He nodded, stood, and requested a brief recess. Council Chair Varn Delic, presiding over the session, granted it with the air of a victorious magistrate. The look in his eyes was common to those who believed they'd orchestrated surrender. He would never see Volan again. Outside the chamber, on Silent Meridian, final synchronization sequences completed. The satellite mesh relay now controlled every transmission off Jervan's table, filtering, duplicating, and erasing in equal measure. Earth's disappearance had begun not with a war cry, not with ships, but with compliance. Volan didn't need to win the argument. He needed to ensure no one remembered what the system looked like before Earth walked away. And with the infrastructure now decaying beneath their feet, the Council would have no choice but to ask a question they had never prepared for. What if the species we tried to contain was never inside the system to begin with? Consul Darren Volan re-entered the tribunal chamber without expression. The lights had dimmed slightly since the last recess, adjusted for interspecies ocular ranges, but the room remained functionally unchanged. The chairs of the Volrix block formed a crescent along the elevated dais, their posture equal parts confidence and boredom. Some delegates exchanged filtered statements in low tones. Others skimmed through legal summaries that had been prepared before Earth had even arrived. There was no urgency here, only the expectation of control. No one noticed the way Volan's stride aligned exactly with the shadow cast by the central lighting halo. No one registered that his diplomatic slate had been replaced with a dull, matte black tablet, void of interface lights, bearing no council-compatible identifier, and when he placed it on the ceremonial pedestal, it made no sound. That silence was the beginning. He did not ask to speak. He did not request attention. Instead, he reached forward and touched the analog sensor buried at the tablet's core, a pressure plate keyed to the molecular weight of Earth's appointed delegate, timed to both local chronocycle and orbital relay confirmation. There was no ceremony, no gesture, only a brief pause. Then the chamber lights blinked once, not in failure, but in compliance. A soft tonal pulse followed, low, harmonic, ancient, the same tone used by council chambers when acknowledging planetary emergency overrides. Instinctively, half the room reached for interface controls. None of them responded. The central broadcast spire lit with a single line of text, projected not through council protocol, but through an Earth-designed fallback protocol originally approved for use only during asteroid evacuation simulations. It appeared in every delegate's native linguistic base simultaneously. 7 words, not translated, printed. Negotiations are closed. Evacuation begins now. There was no accompanying visual, no elaboration, no voiceover or diplomatic preamble. The sentence lingered for 11 seconds, then vanished. Every terminal, every uplink port, every auxiliary channel connected to Earth-aligned signal architecture severed in unison. Not jammed, cut. Earth's digital voice disappeared, not behind firewalls, but behind silence. Permanent, measurable, intentional. A full-spectrum withdrawal that had no reply function. On the diplomatic moon's lower relay floor, administrators scrambled to re-establish bandwidth with Earth systems. Request packets returned null. Fabrication archives embedded across Jervan's orbital rings entered thermal cascade, corrupting core components with non-reversible logic burns. The station's data mirrors, meant to archive tribunal proceedings, simply blinked out of relevance. Fabrication logs, supply records, transport rosters, all gone, not deleted. Rewritten with null pathing, turned into empty loops designed to consume themselves on activation. Beyond Jervan, across the sector's trade lattice, the collapse accelerated. 512 fabrication centers operating under Earth's licensing vanished from the Council's remote index. It wasn't sabotage, no explosions, no signal spikes. These facilities didn't fail. They unregistered themselves, issuing quiet goodbye pulses before initiating full data self-corruption routines. On the floor of the Concord Logistics Bureau, command algorithms blinked into fail-safe mode, only to find that their backups were also Earth-built and had already been marked obsolete by a reclassification instruction embedded in the diplomatic burst. Then came the AIs. Across 37 primary trade corridors, the node-based administrative systems Earth had deployed to stabilize interspecies traffic began broadcasting one final universal message: end of support. Not a warning, not a threat, a conclusion. One that had already been integrated into their runtime systems years prior. The message acted as a systemic break, locking down access, denying override, severing access to decades of stabilized logistical functions. Without Earth's code management routines, even basic coordination across transit hubs began to misfire. Registry data appeared out of sync. Manifest audits failed checksum. Courier drones drifted unassigned UNAs. Bleed 2 verified docking instructions. Panic arrived not in screams but in fractured systems. Council fleets dispatched to investigate outpost silence found no wreckage, just abandoned infrastructure that no longer spoke any known command protocol. On the rim worlds, entire colonies dependent on Earth's bioconversion sinks began reporting critical errors. Food production routines failed to align with atmospheric regulators. AI caretakers ceased external interaction, interpreting all environmental data as corrupted baseline. No countermeasure existed. Earth had once offered proprietary stability software through council-approved distributors. That software was now missing from all shared registries. Entire systems began blinking red across the Valrix Concord's internal dashboards, and there was no one to call. But the diplomatic burst did more than silence Earth's infrastructure. It activated the forgotten. Somewhere far beyond the official corridors, in systems no longer mapped by council navigators, dormant fleets stirred. They were old. Decades-abandoned colony ships, autonomous freighters, and modular sentry vessels left behind during Earth's early expansion, declared lost, damaged, or irrelevant under the treaty grid's classification audits. Yet they had never been offline. They had been waiting. The evacuation signal wasn't merely a closure, it was a reawakening. Triggers buried inside compressed metadata unpacked when the phrase, "negotiations are closed," passed through long-range signal bands. No command followed. No orders. These ships weren't awaiting instruction. They followed dormant contingency matrices keyed to one event: betrayal acknowledged. They didn't attack. They jammed. Across 14 strategic junctions, communications collapsed. Signal mirrors pulsed false coordinates, mimicking entire sectors. Navigation markers inverted. Council fleets attempting to reposition found their spatial anchors drifting. Entire star maps lost synchronization as Earth's forgotten children closed the doors behind them. The Council had imagined power as the ability to summon fleets, levy sanctions, and issue declarations. Earth had learned that power was the ability to withdraw and make the world collapse without you. And now, as ghost fleets painted the stars in quiet defiance and node AIs whispered their final notices, every empire that had voted for containment understood too late. They had mistaken Earth's silence for submission. It had always been preparation, and the system had already accepted Earth's exit as a final condition. The first fleet to enter the collapsed corridor near Draxel Verge arrived under full combat readiness. 12 war cruisers, 45 interceptors, and a logistics spine retrofitted for mass system reboots. The Valrix Concord assumed it was a surgical breach, a known communications failure coupled with some hidden sabotage. They came prepared to enforce order, to establish control, to reassert presence. What they found instead was absence, strategic, deliberate, and weaponized. The outposts that once managed trade, customs, and council surveillance weren't damaged. They were operational, but only in the most technical sense. Lights flickered, consoles responded, but every node operated on logic paths that no longer acknowledged external input. Authentication loops routed back into themselves. System prompts ignored override authority. Every attempted docking request triggered environmental validation scans that read the conquered vessels as non-existent. The outposts weren't broken. They had simply stopped believing in the world around them. That was only the first sight. Across 14 primary junctions, similar failures rippled through the infrastructure grid. Fleets arrived at anchor nodes only to find that the maps guiding them no longer aligned with reality. Transit tags blinked between outdated signatures and nothingness. Stargates activated at rand, dumping reconnaissance drones into dead vectors or silent voids. Council military coordinators attempted full signal resynchronization, but the traffic mesh had already collapsed into irreconcilable pathways. The collapse wasn't uniform. It was tailored. Each junction, each outpost, each satellite platform behaved slightly differently, enough to make troubleshooting impossible, yet consistent in one shared feature. They no longer answered to anyone. And then, the ghost fleets began to move. They emerged not from Earth, not from the Sol core. They came from the forgotten margins, the far rim colonies Earth had abandoned during its early treaty grid compliance phase. Old transports, long-haul mineral haulers, deep-orbit refineries rigged with obsolete drives and layered with signal echo plating. No two hulls matched, no command tags repeated, but they all moved with the same rhythm. At precisely 14 Hunquag Council standard, each one pulsed a wide-band false navigation burst, corrupting regional anchor data across the surrounding junctions. The Council's fleets scrambled to filter and isolate the disruption, but the pulses were built to match pre-approved emergency formats the Council itself had imported from Earth's own humanitarian protocols decades ago. There was no firewall, no way to distinguish real from synthetic. Within minutes, navigational data collapsed, ships drifted off course, entire patrol formations rotated 0.3 degrees off anchor, just enough to unspool coordination across large-scale deployments. The Conquered tried to respond. Command centers issued escalation notices. Tactical units formed emergency interdiction teams. But the enemy wasn't present. The ghost fleets didn't attack. They didn't even block. They occupied space the way a shadow fills a room, without mass, without noise, without intent. Their presence was disruptive not through force, but through implication. They filled key junctions with ambiguity. No signal could be trusted, no arrival confirmed. If a sensor ping registered a hull, was it a returning fleet or another Earth-triggered phantom mimicking a forgotten ID? One by one, the standard detection frameworks failed, not through jamming, but through saturation. The Council had never taught its systems to doubt the records. Earth had. Earth had built its dependency layers with distrust embedded at the root. On planetary hubs, the collapse accelerated. Terraforming control arrays began rerouting command packets to incorrect subsystems. One water cycle on Ovran Prime resulted in acidifying an entire regional biosphere because the purification protocols defaulted to preset wartime conservation logic. The purifiers weren't broken. They were responding exactly as programmed when detected loss of synchronization exceeded 2 cycles. Concord technicians struggled to reverse the errors, but by then, every rollback attempt triggered recursive safety locks. Power arrays fed feedback into magnetic field regulators, throwing off atmospheric shields. On 2 colonies, emergency evacuation domes sealed not to protect citizens, but to isolate command nodes from user tampering. The Council's own survival systems had turned on them, not by choice, but because they had been trained by Earth's governance scaffolds to prioritize data integrity over species error. It became clear that there was no sabotage, no virus, no enemy fleet, just design. Earth's influence had never been a presence. It had been an instruction set, distributed, modular, and woven into the bones of the systems the Council relied on. Every interface, every protocol revision, every maintenance update had carried Earth's logic structures, not malicious, not hidden, just complete. Concord nations had accepted Earth systems because they worked. They were efficient, stable, and cost-effective. They just hadn't understood that Earth's systems weren't passive. They evolved based on internal integrity chains. And once Earth declared evacuation, those chains had re-evaluated alignment. The result was rejection, not as punishment, as inevitability. Panic within the Conquered spread in administrative waves. First, the logistics branches, the ones responsible for trade reconciliation and patent enforcement, began reporting impossible figures. Output from compliant sectors dropped to 0. Mining haulers reported cargo voids despite confirmed pickups. Fleet fuel records became contradictory. Next came the civilian infrastructure managers, unable to process basic system queries. Then the diplomatic branches, whose communication archives had begun overwriting themselves in compliance with Earth's deletion protocols, triggered not by attack, but by licensing terms long ignored and never fully read. But no war declaration arrived, no message from Earth, no ultimatum, no ambassador, no fleet overhead, only silence, engineered silence. And in that silence, the Council saw their failure. They had not isolated Earth. They had built themselves inside Earth's tools, and now those tools no longer acknowledged their authority. as command posts began shutting down access to their own systems for fear of further corruption, one final realization settled into the minds of the conquered leadership. There was no counterstrike possible, no coordinates to hit, no adversary demanding terms. Earth had retreated. It had never been inside the system in the way the Council had believed. Its retreat was not movement. It was revelation, a design principle, absence as force, collapse as architecture. And now that design was unfolding, beautiful, brutal, and unstoppable. The first time someone named it, the word came from a junior analyst embedded inside the Concord's emergency bureau. She wasn't a strategist or a war technician. She handled infrastructure logs, flagged inconsistencies, annotated variance markers. She didn't scream or panic when her screen showed synchronized failures in 5 unrelated planetary systems. She simply looked at the timing and said what no one else dared to. "It's not an attack," she muttered. "It's a cascade." The name spread through military channels in minutes, and within hours it was carved into every crisis memo across the Concord. Not an attack, not sabotage, just a process already in motion. The cascade. It began with the stabilization protocols. These were the governance engines Earth had distributed over the past decade. Advanced runtime frameworks, originally adopted for their unparalleled efficiency in handling planetary-scale systems. They weren't military tools. They were bureaucratic scaffolding, environmental balancing AIs, transport equilibrium models, civic oversight modules. These were the same engines that had allowed frontier colonies to scale safely and bring multi-species settlements under unified digital law. The Council had praised them, adopted them, standardized them, and now they were burning everything down, not through aggression, but through pure procedural fidelity. The failures weren't loud. There were no explosions. Instead, one by one, stabilizers recalculated alignment metrics and found their host systems in violation. The moment Earth removed itself from diplomatic classification, every protocol Earth had embedded began cross-checking its own operational legitimacy. Without Earth's active verification systems, entire instruction chains enter red contradiction loops. Thermal regulators switched to dormant mode, believing planetary biospheres to be uninitialized. Data security protocols purged archives they believed were counterfeit. Traffic arrays shut down, interpreting all unsanctioned motion as containment breaches. Planets weren't collapsing. They were quarantining themselves, from themselves. The Council scrambled. Warships repositioned across 3 sectors to protect population hubs. Engineers were dispatched to planetary cores to bypass stabilizer code, but every attempt at intervention ran into the same wall. Earth's code wasn't encrypted. It was clean in a way that refused tampering. The override attempts didn't trigger alarms, they simply failed silently. Systems had accepted Earth's logic architecture so deeply that any deviation from it now registered as a system fault. Every fix became a new error. On colony world after colony world, the very tools the Council had used to control growth now refused to function without their original validation keys, and those keys were gone. Not lost, absent by intent. The worst failures happened not on Earth-aligned worlds, but on systems Earth had never even visited directly. These were secondary colonies, outer development hubs, places that had adopted Earth-designed systems not through diplomacy, but through third-party vendors chasing reliability. Places where Earth's name never appeared on any dashboard, but where its architecture lived under every system root. These systems didn't even realize what was happening, they just stopped functioning correctly. No warning, no recognition of fault, only recursive decay. Hospital pods began rationing power for patients who weren't there. Atmospheric regulators shut down under the assumption of full planetary evacuation. In some settlements, emergency shelters sealed permanently, believing their occupants to be as contaminated. A misinterpretation of Earth's now expired evacuation protocols. still running under outdated compliance windows. Council response units found themselves unable to land, their own navigation tags no longer recognized by approach protocols. On one world, a squadron of medical transports triggered an orbital quarantine simply by broadcasting their Council affiliation. The descent beacon shut off. The sky darkened. The entire grid looped back into silence. No shots fired, no shields raised, just protocol execution. Every war fleet sent to stabilize the situation arrived to find themselves irrelevant. There was no enemy to confront, no battle to wage. Earth had issued no threat, but every reactor that powered a stabilizer, every governance AI that maintained order, had received the same final input. Earth absent. Authority chain broken. The logic followed. Order failed. By the time the Volrix Concord convened an emergency session to assess the scale of the failure, the maps on their walls were already obsolete. Trade routes blinked red across entire quadrants. AI-controlled repair fleets drifted, stuck in decision paralysis. No repairs could begin without compliance confirmation, and compliance now pointed to a ghost. Earth's departure hadn't removed a node from the system. It had invalidated the system itself. The entire machine had been built around the assumption of Earth's passive participation, and when that participation ceased, the system didn't just falter, it lost the definition of function altogether. Strategists requested offensive action. They demanded targets, coordinates, something to hit. But every location tied to the collapse had no origin point, no source. Just standard operating environments executing their original code to its logical endpoint. What could they strike? Earth's facilities were already empty, its colonies dark, its fleets absent. There were no transmissions to intercept, no diplomacy to exploit. Earth had removed itself so thoroughly that the system Ning now registered it not as missing but as never present. Even command logs that referenced Earth began to glitch, unable to reconcile internal consistency checks. Entire bureaucratic networks purged their Earth-indexed references just to stop crashing. The war fleets that had once ringed soul corridors became inert, not because they lacked orders, but because their role no longer had a context. They weren't defending against an enemy. They were orbiting the remnants of a concept that had evaporated. Earth hadn't resisted the Council. It had redefined what existed beneath the Council's control. It had used compliance as a fault line, and when it stepped back, it let everything break across that line. This wasn't absence, it was execution, clean, deliberate, irreversible. The most complete offensive configuration ever fielded. And it had arrived without warning, without sound, and without requiring Earth to lift a single weapon. 12 factions failed to appear at the emergency charter review. Their seats, marked by ancestral banners and bio-coded authorization orbs, remained unlit. Council moderators cycled the attendance roll 3 times before shutting down the session. No formal explanation was given. None was needed. By then, those 12 had already begun internal tests of Earth's sovereignty modules, the localized governance frameworks Earth once offered as open source, and which the Council had dismissed as too rigid, too decentralized, too non-compliant with interstellar hierarchy. Now, those very systems were being unpacked, studied, reverse-engineered, not for integration, for survival. Across the Rim empires, systems began to collapse not from war or rebellion, but from biology. Earth's biotech stabilizers, quiet tools buried in atmospheric regulators and food synthesis protocols, had ceased broadcasting maintenance harmonics. The results were slow, then immediate. Crop yields twisted toward unusable variants. Atmospheric pumps miscalculated mineral saturation and triggered cascade loops. Colonies that had never seen a single Earth-born warship began losing oxygen balance because their terraforming logic trees, originally Earth-licensed, had no fallback mode when central support was removed. Thousands of satellites, still running Earth-authored calibration cycles, flagged themselves as abandoned and entered indefinite drift states, taking entire biosphere synchronizations with them. These were not malfunctions. These were decisions. Quiet ones, triggered the moment Earth declared its withdrawal not as protest, but as protocol. Volin had been gone for 12 minutes when the chamber's central spire went dark. His extraction corridor, mapped through the understructure of Jervin's table, had been routed and tested 2 years earlier, before the tribunal had ever been proposed. Every step, every junction, every security node had been pre-cleared through diplomatic redundancies buried in outdated codebooks that the Council had never bothered to revise. His path was invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it had been written long ago and then forgotten. By the time his diplomatic closure signal executed, he was already beyond reach, folded into a classified shuttle with no Earth markings and no registry trace. The shuttle didn't head to Earth. It didn't need to. Volin's task wasn't to deliver demands or lead negotiations. It was to leave a room empty at the right moment. That room, the tribunal chamber on Jervin's table, remained sealed, not by order, not by force, by function. The override message, printed in analog, continued its loop on every wall-mounted display, not as speech, not as a recording, as an environmental variable, a protocol output. The message wasn't a declaration. It was a status code, fixed into the chamber's primary interface language. Attempts to mute it failed. Attempts to scrub the signal forced system reboots that only reloaded the loop. Eventually, Council staff abandoned efforts to overwrite it. They shut down power to the displays, but even emergency lights reignited the message. Earth's voice was not lingering out of arrogance. It remained because it had never been a message at all. It was a new system constant. Across Council space, the realization set in like creeping frost. Earth had not broken treaties. It had not violated code. It had simply completed every contract, fulfilled every condition, and walked away in a manner so complete that the galaxy's infrastructure collapsed from the vacuum. Silence echoed louder than weaponry ever could. Attempts to re-establish diplomatic lines returned null packets. Translation modules, still Earth-authored, rejected Council authentication as invalid. AI advisory systems, decades ago upgraded with Earth's predictive matrices, flagged incoming Council directives as unverified and locked themselves into observation mode. The Conquered, once unified by protocol efficiency, now struggled to complete interplanetary food shipments. Flight paths rerouted mid-transit. Maintenance drones looped endlessly between phantom repair tickets that no longer linked to viable registries. And through it all, Earth made no claim. No territory changed hands. No tribute was demanded. No ambassador returned. Earth had simply withdrawn. The terms of its departure had not been spoken aloud. They had been encoded, embedded, and executed. And that execution did not leave wreckage. It left disconnection. It was not a rebellion. It was a reset. The final reports submitted to the Council by independent archivists did not list casualties or military losses. They recorded system failures, thousands of them. Governance infrastructure misalignments, logic 2, collapses, regulatory blindness. The infrastructure had not been attacked. It had been designed to expire without Earth, and no one had ever thought to ask what expiration looked like until it arrived. As administrative sectors flickered offline one by one, each node displayed the same closing line, printed in the format Earth used when offboarding legacy systems. It appeared on walls, in terminals, on fleet dashboards, and station control decks. A flat statement, no signature, no color, no ambiguity. Support channel, Earth, status, closed. The Council never found anyone to hold accountable. No passwords to unlock, no saboteurs to interrogate, no master switch to flip. Earth had made a choice, not to dominate, not to retaliate, but to demonstrate. A lesson, not in war, but in dependence. Not a cry for respect, but a precision-triggered collapse of assumption. And in the silence that followed, Every council voice fell to the same unspoken truth. What happens when the species you sidelined builds the kill switch into your own system and then walks away before you realize it was ever there?